Hi, I'm Megan. Welcome to today's live reading of Ghosts of Alda by Russell Archey, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Join me. The Grove. An elf kind sat in a chair within a grove. On a table fashioned of one block of pure quartz sat a cup that held swiftly cooling tea. The elf kind smiled as he watched a couple of fox kids tumble just outside the tree line. His chair was simple, carved of wood and without a cushion, and greatly mismatched against the elegant table, but he was comfortable. The afternoon sun was almost unnoticeable behind the western edge of the canopy. Its warmth was still quite present, however. He tended this grove. He was its keeper. This was no ordinary grove, but a cluster of the precious alders revered by his people. They were not held in the same respect by dwarves or humans, but their importance was not lost on the other races, regardless. Since the first days of their world, Alda, these trees represented the blossoming eternal spirit of every continent. They were the world's soul, connected to Alda and everything living on it and within it. Elves ensured that all their forested lands grew strong and withstood the grasping fingers of industry and expanding cities, but being a grove of Alders, elf kind, of noble birth, and not directly in line for succession, was allowed to tend it. His particular bloodline was known for its longevity, even among the long-lived elves. He was perfect for the role. Most grove tenders went about their work and then returned to the elven cities within the forest. This elf kind preferred to stay among his trees, his alders. He sat for hours at a time, watching the creatures of the morning hours, elk, rabbits, and birds. He watched as the fog hid them within its chill obscurity and allowed them to eat in safety. He watched in the afternoon, like today, as the kids played and squirrels ran up and down the trees in their frenzied work. Even in the evenings, when he stayed late and the tea was switched out for wine, he listened to the owls call and the crickets and frogs sing an off-key melody. The larger animals of the night revealed themselves as their eyes caught in the moonlight. Visitors would come to speak of casual things and of elf-kind business. They would sit and drink with him and bring him food, insisting he needed more to subsist on than alder fruit. Such was the way of things for many, many years. One day, the grove became quiet. No songbirds called, no animals skulked or skittered about their business. Even the air felt different. The wind was deathly still, and the grove tender felt on edge. Something was wrong. An ear-splitting sound cut the air, a moan, like that of a massive dying beast, followed immediately after, thrumming through the grove tender and sending a panicked shudder along his bones. Something was very wrong. After several moments, his skin stopped trying to crawl from his body, and the panic ebbed. He felt different, though. A tiny pinprick of hollowness ached within his soul. He just breathed through it, taking deep, calming breaths. What had just happened? He sat in his chair, sipped on his tea, and listened for the sound of the grove, the animals, and the wind. All was still silent and unmoving. He was so preoccupied with looking through the trunks of the alders for any sign of life that it took him several hours to look up to the sky. A purple welt, laced with thin streaks of lightning-like exposed, pulsating veins, ran the length of the view above the canopy. He stood quickly, haphazardly, rocking the table and knocking over the cup and its lukewarm contents. This grove was deep within the forest kingdom, on the eastern side of the northern continent. Trees ran for 100 miles in any direction. A gap in the canopy in the midst of these alders provided him a window to the sky. He looked up at the brilliant hole in the canopy, at what once was a brilliant blue sky, staring back like a still, serene pond among the blossoms. Now the pond ran red like blood, with an angry, bruise-colored streak slashing through it. It was quite isolated. The closest other sovereignties being a few human towns and a small dwarven kingdom, all near the western Belagant Mountains. Beyond that, the Blackwood Forest, and then the cold northernmost city-state of Kultiv. This great rupture in the sky must have stretched even further, all the way to the western end of the continent by Carnelia. An ill feeling overtook the elf kind, sending up a wave of debilitating nausea to well up from his gut into his throat. He fell back into his chair. His vision began to blur, then darken. Strange sounds and dark shapes came from within the forest all around him. He thought these were the animals panicking. Birds took flight in screeching flocks from the trees. Small animals were crying out and scurrying into their burrows. Wolves were running with their tails between their legs, and bears were growling in anger and fear. His head lolled to the side, and as he tried to straighten it to force himself to stay conscious, it merely flopped to the other side. His muscles had all the strength of limp saplings, his mind growing foggy as the riverbanks on the dawn hours. All that remained of his vision was a blurred, narrow tunnel. The frenzied silhouettes of the animals still darted between the trees in that narrow tunnel. Sometimes they looked at him, and their eyes gleamed with something other than fear. Perhaps it was the abyss of unconsciousness closing in, but the dark outlines no longer looked like any animals he had ever seen. The first sensation he recognized was his skin tingling. His eyes were slow to open and felt heavy. His head pounded. He felt intoxicated. A subtle wind kissed his arms where the sleeves of his robe had pulled up from his weak flailing. The tingling sensation was the chill kiss of that wind, too cold for the season. His mouth was dry and bitter. Moments passed as he tried to remember where he was. Trees surrounded him. White blossoms covered the ground in a light blanket like early winter snow. He was in his grove, surrounded by his alders. But why were the blossoms falling? They never fell, not in fall or winter. Whether the heat of the summer or the bitter cold of the winter, the blossoms and leaves never fell. He blinked his eyes, wiped the residue of sleep from them, and looked again. He wasn't dreaming, and his vision wasn't failing. The alders were dying. In his bones, he recognized this truth. His own body suddenly frailer. The weight of encroaching mortality weighed on him. Approaching one of the sacred trees, he placed his hand on its trunk and took a deep breath. He needed to tell those in the city. A low noise came from behind the trunks of the trees before him. It sounded like a growl, angry and cautionary. He retreated, stepping back into the grove. The oaks and ash trees were closer on this border, and their boughs were still full. The shade they provided was thick, and past the alders he saw something there. Something slouched behind one of the broad trunks. The elf kind called out to them, but the shape didn't move. He couldn't tell if it was animal or elf kind. He called out again and took a few steps toward the grove's edge. The shape came out from behind the tree. It skulked like a goblin from the swamps, only taller and lankier. Its four-fingered hand splayed out on the trunk beside it as though it hesitated to leave the shelter. Another one of them came from behind the next tree. They lurched slowly in his direction, hissing and growling like wounded cats. His breath caught and he stumbled backward. An exposed root caught the back of his heel and he fell bodily onto the ground, the white blossoms exploding around him. The creatures stopped when they reached the alders and stared at him. They began circling around to the other side of the grove. He watched in horror as their ungainly, unnatural movements took them further away as the band of alders grew thicker. They appeared to be repelled by the trees. He also noticed as they walked, the grass and bushes below their feet wilted, turning yellow, then brown, then black as decay took them in moments. The other side of the grove were no different. Everywhere the elf kind ran to try to escape to make it back to the capital, there was something waiting. Either more of the wretched gangly creatures or other shapes of various sizes, all unrecognizable and all wrapped in shadow. He was trapped. Moving the table to the center of the grove, along with what supplies he had, the elf kind waited. The days and nights turned into a different kind of wretched cycle. The days felt cold and strange. All manner of unnameable and unwholesome creatures waited patiently behind the broad trunks of the trees. The alders, standing like fatigued sentinels against them, continued to shed their blossoms a little more each day. Every sunrise brought them closer and closer to death. In the evenings, the sun setting, now more visible through the thinning canopy, caught the eyes of the creatures and reflected a hateful glimmer. After nightfall, an entirely new world took over. The moonlight seemed to cast their shadows even deeper. The things waiting on the outskirts of the grove were even more visible in the darkness of this new strange night. Stars the elf kind had never seen before shone through the open space above the grove. Now, instead of a pool of blue during the day and shimmering black at night, it felt like an eye watching and judging. Instead of offering a sense of serenity, it made him feel exposed, as though something were watching from far away. The weeks passed and no one came to his aid. The wine ran out after a few days. Thankfully, the empty bottles caught enough rain to survive on. The food also did not last long. The alder fruit fell just as the leaves had, and for the first time in his long life, he saw them begin to soften and rot on the ground. It brought him to the verge of tears, but he ate them for as long as he could. After a few weeks, desperation set in, and his standards for what he could consume lowered significantly. The alders continued to wither, their branches became stiff and dry, the blossoms on the ground turned to shades of ashen gray and brown. They crunched under his feet as he circled the grove, listening to the angry, whining growls of the things with the presence of decay and the shadowy creatures that darted between the trees. As the alder slowly died, the creatures pressed closer to the border of the grove. The elf kind knew no magic and carried only a small dagger, a family heirloom, for protection. He never once had to remove it. It seemed so trivial to carry that he left it under the ornate table, only carrying it back and forth between the grove and the city. He withdrew it from under the table and pulled it from its sheath, the sharp blade catching the dappled light of the sun. He looked at it forlornly, feeling the cold steel in his fingers. Hearing the throaty, gargled noises from outside the grove, he placed the flat edge against his wrist, felt the cold weapon against his skin. He turned the blade to its sharpened edge and felt the cold work its way into his soul. The growling seemed to intensify. The creatures were watching him, goading him. He hesitated. His thoughts went to his family back in his city. He had no children, but his brother had several. He wondered what had become of his beloved nieces and nephews of these last few weeks. Life is sacred to elfkind, those long-lived stewards of the longer-lived forest. Suicide, they believed, brought a curse onto those who took the precious gift of life from themselves. Elfkind believed that upon their death, their souls would become a new alder. Taking one's own life, however, doomed one to walk the world forever, until one became a vengeful specter for eternity. His eyes went from the blade to the creatures in the woods. They were even closer now. Any day could hold the moment they broke through and came for him. The darkness of their presence and the shadow of the creatures around them never lifted, even as they stood with their feet just outside the grove's border. His grip weakened as he saw the grisly creature at this closer distance. The knife slipped from his fingers, and he stood from the table. He walked closer, each step bringing a larger pang of horrifying realization to his already stretched mind. The whining growl from the creature reached a ghastly new pitch. It splayed its hand over the tree next to it as though it would spring on the grove tinder, but it was still held back by a thin row of dying alders. The elf kind stood, his breath escaping a sharp, broken rhythm from his open mouth. A tear finally escaped his eyes as he saw the creature up close for the first time. Though many of their features were shrouded in unnatural darkness that fell from their bodies like a rancorous mist, a small pendant on a chain could just be seen beyond the cloying miasma that clung to the thing. It was distinctively elven design, as was the clothing that could be seen. The point of their ears was also unmistakable. The second creature stepped out from behind them as though from the miasma itself. This one had features of a female in elegant dress. They both stared at him with a hatred that defied description. The one bearing the pendant placed a splayed hand against an adjacent tree as though it would launch itself at the elf kind. The grove tender turned his back on them, hearing their growls pick up again. He walked trance-like back to his table at the center of the grove. Sitting down, he picked up the dagger again and clutched it tightly. No help was coming. The pendant on the thing in the woods bore symbols of the city. Something had happened there when the sky opened and the world cried out. He would never know the fate of his people. Whatever the things outside the grove were looking in the unnatural darkness they brought with them, they were not his kin any longer. The shadowy things that skulked at their feet, darting amongst the trees where the forest creatures once lived, were not of this world. These were grotesque remnants of what should have been, ghosts of the world before the rapture that brought on the events of last week. The elf kind sat in his chair at his table. He took a slow drink from the last bit of rainwater that his wine glass had caught. The rainy season was ending. The fruits of the trees were rotted. He held the knife but refused to use it on himself. Maybe the revenants in the woods were the ghosts of those who couldn't bear the new world and took the same way out he had considered. He couldn't become one of them. He would simply wait and watch the last blossoms fall from the alders.